In 1959, little Richard shocked the world, but not by getting married, by opening his Bible and crying on his wedding night. The world knew him as rock and roll's wild prince. But in that quiet room in Macon, Georgia, suitcases were packed and God was calling. He made one of the most shocking decisions in music history. He married Ernestine Campbell. This wasn't just a love marriage. This was a desperate man's last attempt to be normal after battling his own identity. After the wedding ceremony, Richard Wayne Penniman went home, opened his Bible and cried out, "Lord, change me, make me normal." But what started that night wasn't just a marriage. It was a 4-year performance. Every night lying next to his wife, he felt like he was committing a different sin, the sin of lying, because he loved Ernestine, but not the way he was supposed to love her. And 4 years later, Ernestine's final words would still echo in his ears, "Richard, you're not married to me, you're married to God, and God loves you because you hate your real self." In this video, we're going to explore music history's most complicated marriage story. If you want to dive deep into Little Richard's identity struggle, please subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the truths we're about to reveal show the most fragile side of a legend. Escaping Macon, Georgia, and the first search. Little Richard's marriage story actually started way earlier, back in his childhood in Macon, Georgia. When he got kicked out of his father's house at 13, Richard Wayne Penniman wasn't just a kid. He was a soul that didn't fit society's norms, trying to figure out his own identity. His father, Charles Bud Penniman's horrible words, "Get out of my house, you little faggot," weren't just words a father said in anger. They were wounds carved into young Richard's mind that he'd carry for life. That night, sleeping on the streets, young Richard made himself a promise. Someday he'd be strong enough, successful enough, and maybe then he'd be accepted. Maybe then he could prove he was normal. But that 13-year-old kid couldn't know that his marriage decision at 30 would be born from this trauma. This early trauma cast a shadow over all of Little Richard's future relationships. When he got on stage, he could be wild, free, limitless, because the stage was the only place he could put on his mask, hide his real identity behind the performance. But when those stage lights went down, all that was left was Richard Wayne Penniman, rejected by his father, outcasted by society, fighting his own identity. And the most destructive battle of this war would open in the late 1950s. As he approached 30, the search for marriage and normalcy. After that plane incident in 1957, Little Richard had quit rock and roll to become a preacher. But this wasn't just a career change. This was an attempt to transform into a completely different identity. He was trying to kill his stage persona Little Richard and recreate Richard Wayne Penniman in a way that would please God. And the most critical step in this recreation was marriage, because marriage was the most basic proof of social normalcy. But what he didn't know yet was that this search for proof would drag him into an even deeper lie. Ernestine Campbell, the perfect wife candidate. Meeting Ernestine Campbell was one of the most critical turning points in Little Richard's life. The night they met at a gospel concert in Washington, D.C. in 1958, when Richard first saw her, his heart started racing. But this wasn't the rapid beat of romantic love. This was hope beating. Ernestine was beautiful, religious, had traditional values, on paper the perfect preacher's wife. More importantly, when he looked at her, he could feel normal. Maybe if he was with her, those wrong desires would disappear. Maybe he really could be a heterosexual man. But the thought that went through his mind as he approached Ernestine that night would determine the future of this relationship. This woman can save me from myself. Ernestine saw something different in Richard. The former rock and roll star was now involved in preaching, serving God. This was a very attractive combination for a woman with strong religious faith. Richard's wild performances from his past, his stage persona didn't bother Ernestine because he had left that life behind now. In fact, this past made his turn to God even more meaningful. Ernestine saw Richard as a saved soul, and maybe she could be part of this salvation. Two people, two different salvation dreams, but neither knew how painful the truth could be. After 6 months of a brief courtship, they decided to get married, but this decision was a matter of life and death for Little Richard. Marrying Ernestine would be proof that he had won the war against his own identity. He would prove to society, his family, and most importantly to God, that he was now a fixed man. The night he proposed, Little Richard looked in the mirror for hours and whispered to himself, "This is gonna work. This time will be different. This time I'll be normal." but the reflection looking back at him didn't seem convinced at all. The proposal was so full of desperation that even Ernestine noticed, but she interpreted it as religious excitement, because Richard had told her, "God sent you to me, Ernestine. You are my salvation." These words had touched Ernestine's heart, but when it came to the real meaning, it would be much darker. The wedding, a mix of hope and fear. The wedding on September 12, 1959 was a big event for the music community. The former rock and roll king's marriage drew major media attention. Newspapers ran headlines like "Little Richard gets married, rock and roll prince finally settles down." But no photo from that wedding day could reflect the storm inside Little Richard. No matter how beautiful Ernestine looked in her wedding dress, the only thing going through Richard's mind was, "God, please let this work. Please change me." The moment he said "I do" at the wedding ceremony, Little Richard felt like he was making a deal, not just with Ernestine but with all of society, with God, and with his own conscience. This marriage would be proof that he could be normal. But right after the ceremony, while guests were still there, Richard went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. The man standing there was still the same man, same desires, same fears, same inner conflicts. Nothing had changed. There was just a new mask to hide it with now, the marriage mask. And as that mask got heavier, it would suffocate Richard even more. That night in the marriage bed, Little Richard faced the most horrible truth of his life. Lying next to Ernestine, he had never felt so alone. He loved his wife, he really did. But this wasn't romantic partner love. This was a mixture of deep friendship, protective feelings, even gratitude. But it wasn't the kind of love a man was supposed to have for his wife. And Ernestine felt this difference too. She just couldn't name it yet. What Richard did that night was start the biggest performance of his life. Every morning when he woke up, he'd start playing the role of loving husband, and every night when he went to bed, he'd take off this role. But the worst part was, this performance started feeling so natural to him that sometimes he thought he really was in love, until reality slapped him like a punch. First year, getting lost in the performance. The first months of marriage were a learning process for both people. Ernestine was trying to get used to her husband's strange habits, waking up in the middle of the night to read the Bible, staring in the mirror for hours, praying silently, sometimes crying out of nowhere. Richard was trying to learn how to play the good husband role, how he should drink his morning coffee, how he should talk to his wife, how he should behave at home. Both were putting on a performance, but Richard's performance was more intense because he had more to hide. For the first 6 months, Richard focused on perfecting this performance. Every morning he'd look in the mirror and mentally rehearse that day's Richard Wayne Penniman good husband role. He'd plan what words to say, how to smile, how to touch his wife. The planning itself showed him how deep a lie he was living in, but he refused to notice it. One of the hardest moments of the first year was when Ernestine asked Richard for children. This request threw Richard into a panic because a child would make their marriage even more real. Having a child meant making this lie permanent, but how could he explain this to Ernestine? He couldn't say "I don't want children because this marriage is a lie." So he found other excuses. "I'm not ready yet, we need to fix our finances first. We should wait for God's timing." Every excuse added another lie to the pile of lies in Richard's heart. The most painful was when Ernestine asked, "Don't you love children?" And he answered, "Of course I do, it's just not the right time." Because he really did love children, but he couldn't bear for a child from this marriage to start life built on lies. This contradiction tormented him so much that he couldn't sleep at night. During this period, Little Richard's concerts also changed. When he got on stage, he didn't have his old wild energy anymore, because as a married preacher, he had to be more cautious. But this caution was hurting his performance. When audiences saw Little Richard wasn't as enthusiastic as before, they felt disappointed. And when Richard felt this disappointment, the conflict inside him grew even bigger. He was killing his stage identity to protect his marriage, but without his stage identity, he didn't know who he was. One night, backstage after a concert, when Richard looked in the mirror, he realized he hated himself. Neither his stage identity nor his marriage identity was real. Both were performances. And worst of all, he couldn't even remember what his real identity was anymore. Second and third years, rising tension. 1962 were the years when cracks in Little Richard's marriage became visible. Ernestine could no longer explain her husband's strange behaviors as just artist temperament. Richard crying in the middle of the night, constantly reading the Bible, but never seeming truly happy bothered her. Most of all, Richard's avoidance of touching her caught her attention. At first she had interpreted this as respect, but gradually she began to understand it had a different reason. The horrible line Ernestine wrote in her diary summed up everything. Richard acts like he needs me, but looks at me like he doesn't want me. What does this mean? The answer to this question would be much more painful. Richard was becoming increasingly isolated. When he was home with Ernestine, he felt trapped, but when he was alone, he felt guilty too. This situation led him to more religious activities. He started preaching more at church, reading religious books, praying constantly. As if he prayed enough, read the Bible enough, God could change him. But these obsessive religious behaviors also bothered Ernestine because her husband was now only interested in God, not her. The most dramatic moment was when Richard woke up one night screaming, "Forgive me, Lord, forgive me," from a dream. While Ernestine was trying to calm him down, Richard told her, "You don't understand, Ernestine. I've committed a very big sin," but he never said what sin it was. During this period, little Richard's biggest fear was Ernestine discovering the truth. Sometimes his wife would ask him surprise questions, wanting details about his past. Richard panicked at these questions because every answer added another lie to their marriage built on lies. One of the hardest moments was when Ernestine asked, "Do you really love me?" Richard had said of course, but saying those words he felt a great weight in his heart, because he loved her, but not the way she wanted, and this difference was growing every day. The line in Richard's diary said it all. "I'm not dying because I'm lying to Ernestine, I'm dying because I can't tell her the truth." This difference was very critical for him because the truth was much more painful than the lie. Fourth year, collapse and acceptance. In the fall of 1962, little Richard decided to return to the stage. This decision was the beginning of the first major crisis in their marriage. Ernestine couldn't understand her husband's return to rock and roll. When she asked, "Why are you leaving preaching?" Richard's answer wasn't clear. "This music is part of me, I can't live without it." But the real reason was much deeper. Richard felt like he was losing himself in marriage, and returning to the stage meant returning to his real identity. When Ernestine couldn't understand this explanation, she pressed harder. "Are you leaving God's work to return to the devil's music?" This question drove Richard crazy because he couldn't live without music while married to a woman who saw his music as devil's work. When he returned to the stage, little Richard's performances came alive again. His old energy came back, his makeup got heavier, his costumes more glittery. But this change widened the gap between Richard at home and little Richard on stage even more. Ernestine couldn't recognize her husband anymore. Quiet, withdrawn Richard during the day at home, wild little Richard at night on stage. The transition between these two identities was so sudden and dramatic that Ernestine began to suspect her husband had multiple personality disorder. The most shocking moment was when Richard came home one night still in his stage makeup. When Ernestine opened the door, she didn't see her husband but a man she didn't recognize. When she asked, "Who are you?" Richard's answer would be the first sign of words that would end their marriage. "I'm little Richard, and I think Richard Wayne Penniman doesn't exist anymore." In early 1963, they had their biggest fight ever. Ernestine wanted to know more about Richard's past, who he had been with during his stage years, what his real feelings were, why he always seemed so unhappy. Richard felt cornered by these questions. If he told the truth, their marriage would end. If he lied, he would destroy himself even more. What he did faced with this dilemma was to become completely silent. He didn't talk for days, didn't leave the house, just read the Bible and prayed. This silence drove Ernestine crazy because she now understood her husband was running away from her, and she was beginning to sense why he was running. The breaking point. You're married to God. In the final months of their marriage, Ernestine was starting to see clues to the truth. Richard never really touching her, constantly feeling guilty, never being completely happy. When all these came together, a painful picture emerged. Ernestine understood that her husband didn't not love her, but wasn't in love with her, and she was slowly grasping what this difference meant. The most critical moment was the night Richard's friend Johnny came to the house. Ernestine noticed that her husband never looked at her the way he looked at Johnny. There was a kind of longing, a kind of pain in that look, and in that moment everything fell into place. The final fight started like an ordinary argument. Ernestine asked Richard why he was never romantic, why he always kept his distance. Richard got defensive, tried to clear himself, but Ernestine had seen too much to be brushed off with empty words anymore. "Richard," she said, her voice filled with both anger and pain, "I've been married to you for 4 years, but I never really knew you. You've always played a role. On stage, at home, at church, you're always playing someone else's role." These words deeply wounded little Richard because they were true. Ernestine continued, "You're not married to me, Richard. You're married to God. And the reason God loves you is because you hate your real self. You hate your own identity so much that you're trying to be someone else to please God." These words had a shock effect on little Richard because he thought no one could see this clearly. Ernestine's final blow was the most painful. "I deserve to be loved as a woman, and you deserve to be loved as a man. But that man isn't you. That man is who you're trying to be. Who is the real you, Richard? I never saw him." This question completely broke little Richard because he didn't know who the real Richard was either. That night when Ernestine left the house, little Richard was alone in his own home for the first time. And this loneliness brought him something he had never felt in his life: relief. He didn't have to play a role anymore, but the fear that came with this relief was bigger. He didn't know who he was without the mask. Divorce and after, facing the truth. Ernestine leaving the house meant both relief and destruction for little Richard. Relief because he didn't have to play a role anymore. Destruction because the marriage mask was gone too, and only naked truth remained. When the divorce papers came, the first thing Richard did was take off his makeup and look in the mirror. "This is me," he said to himself. "For the first time, this is really me." But who was this me? At 31, he was maskless for the first time in his life. There was stage identity little Richard. There was marriage identity Richard Wayne Penniman. But who was the real one? This question would be the beginning of a new journey for him. The first months after the divorce were a period of getting reacquainted with his own identity for little Richard. He didn't have to play the good husband role anymore, but he was also alone. Even though his marriage to Ernestine ended in failure, he felt great gratitude toward her, because Ernestine had taught him the most important lesson: while trying to be someone else, you can lose your real identity. Most importantly, Ernestine had shown him this: love is only possible with honesty. In a relationship built on lies, neither the lover nor the beloved can be happy. This lesson would shape the rest of little Richard's life. During this period, little Richard lived one of the most honest periods of his life. When he returned to the stage, his performances became more authentic, more real, because there was no other role to play at home anymore. The distance between his stage identity and real identity decreased. This change was reflected in his music too. His songs after 1964 became more profound, more emotional because he was now singing without a mask. Most striking was the increase in authenticity in his stage performances. Audiences felt that little Richard was more real than they had ever seen before, because he had nothing left to hide. Ernestine's perspective, secret diaries. Years later, when Ernestine Campbell's personal diaries came to light, how the marriage looked from a woman's perspective was also understood. Ernestine had sensed that Richard was different from the beginning of their marriage, but she had attributed this to his artist character. According to what she wrote in her diaries, she knew Richard was never really in love with her, but despite this, she hoped she could change him, heal him. One of the most painful diary entries was, "Richard needs me, but doesn't want me. I want him, but don't need him. We both married for the wrong reasons. He to appear normal, me to save him, but neither of us is happy." These lines showed how complex a dynamic their marriage had. The most shocking discovery in Ernestine's diaries was her recording of the moment she fully understood Richard's identity. "Today I saw Richard looking at Johnny, and I understood that look was never directed at me. There was love in that look, longing, pain. I'm just a mask protecting him from real love." This realization was both devastating and enlightening for Ernestine. It was devastating because she understood her husband never loved her that way. It was enlightening because she could now understand the reasons for Richard's behavior. Ernestine's biggest regret was not giving Richard more space. In her diaries, "I wish I had said to him, 'Love me as you are.' Maybe then we both could have been happy. But I was also a woman of the 1950s. I wanted a normal marriage. Now I understand there's no such thing as normal, only what's honest." This confession showed the effect of the period's social pressures on both women and men. Ernestine's final diary entry revealed the power of forgiveness. "I don't blame Richard. He's also a victim of society, his family, even his own beliefs. I hope someday he makes peace with his real identity, because the real Richard was a much more beautiful person than the husband I imagined. Little Richard's later relationships. After divorcing Ernestine, Little Richard never married again. This decision was very important for him because he didn't want to fool anyone anymore, not someone else, not himself. He had romantic relationships in the following years, but none turned into marriage, because Richard now knew that marriage was a tool for lies for him. In a 1970s interview, Little Richard said about his marriage to Ernestine, "Ernestine was a good woman, I was a bad husband, but the problem wasn't with either of us. The problem was that I wasn't at peace with myself. A person must first learn to love themselves, then they can love someone else. I hated myself, how could I love her?" This confession showed how much he had matured. The most striking change happened in Little Richard's personal relationships in the 1980s. He was starting to be more open about identity, more honest about emotions. His close friendship with a friend named Charles White showed Richard what real intimacy was like. This relationship wasn't romantic, but for the first time he could be completely honest with someone. He had told Charles, "You're the first person to accept me without a mask." This friendship was an important part of Richard's healing process. In the 1980s, when they met again with Ernestine, both approached the past with understanding. Ernestine had told Richard, "You did your best during that period." Richard replied, "You tried to love me as I was, I tried to be what you imagined." This mutual understanding was healing for both. Most touching was what Ernestine said to Richard, "I wish I had known this then. Trying to change you meant I didn't love you. Not being able to accept you as you were was my problem." This self-criticism showed what a great woman Ernestine was. Lessons and legacy. Little Richard's marriage to Ernestine Campbell is one of music history's most instructive failure stories. This marriage shows that love alone isn't enough. Honesty is also necessary. Richard really loved Ernestine, but he wasn't honest with her. He was even fooling himself. This marriage also shows how destructive the social pressures of the 1950s could be. Little Richard hurt both himself and Ernestine because of the pressure to be socially normal. If that period had been a time when queer identity was more accepted, maybe both their lives would have been different. The most valuable lesson from this story is the importance of authenticity. Little Richard said years later, "My biggest sin wasn't lying to Ernestine, it was lying to myself, because when I lied to myself, I had to lie to her too." This insight applies to modern relationships too. You must first be honest with yourself, then you can be honest with someone else. The identity conflict Richard experienced is an experience many people still have today, being stuck between social expectations and personal truths. Little Richard's advice in his final years was, "Don't stop being yourself for anyone, not for God, not for society, not for family. Because in a life where you're not yourself, no one can really love you, not even you." This saying was the most valuable lesson that 4 years of painful marriage had taught him. Behind this advice was this conclusion he drew from his experience with Ernestine. Two people can really love each other, but in a relationship built on lies, this love becomes poison. Because the person you love isn't the real you, it's who you're trying to be. The deepest lesson was this: identity conflict can hurt not just the person, but also their loved ones. Richard had deceived Ernestine to protect himself, but in the end both were hurt. That's why Little Richard's biggest regret in his final years was not being honest with Ernestine. "If I had told her the truth from the beginning, maybe we could have built a friendship, but by lying, we lost both friendship and love." Final meeting and farewell. When Ernestine Campbell died in 2018, Little Richard attended the funeral. He stood by the coffin and said, "Forgive me, Ernestine, I couldn't love you the way you deserved." This apology, even though it was 60 years late, was important for both of them, because this marriage wasn't just a failure, it was an instructive experience for both sides. What Little Richard said at the funeral showed how much he had changed. "Ernestine gave me the greatest gift. She taught me the value of honesty. Having to lose her taught me how to find myself." After the funeral, Little Richard talked with Ernestine's daughter Sandra. Sandra mentioned that her mother always spoke well of Little Richard in her final years. "My mother always said, 'He wasn't your father, but he was a good man. He just didn't know himself during that period.'" These words deeply affected Little Richard because they showed that despite Ernestine's angry departure, She had forgiven and understood him over the years. His response to Sandra showed little Richard's maturity. "Your mother was a much stronger person than me. She was ready to love me as I was. I wasn't ready to show myself as I was." Looking back today, little Richard's marriage to Ernestine Campbell is an example showing how important authenticity is. If there's love but no honesty, even with the best intentions, people can hurt each other. Richard and Ernestine's story took its place in music history as the most sad but most instructive example of this painful truth. And maybe that's why little Richard started being so open about identity in his final years. He wanted to share the lesson Ernestine taught him so other couples wouldn't have to experience it.